Thank you, President Randy. Uh, Before I left Kent State University Press, it was my pleasure to work with Gary Sosniecki on his book, his true crime book. Gary is a retired journalist who worked at newspapers in 4 states during his 43-year career. He has received dozens of awards for journalism excellence from state, national, and international newspaper organizations, including the Eugene Cervi Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society of Weekly Newspaper Editors. Gary was inducted into the Missouri Press Association Hall of Fame in 2014. He is the great-grandson of the victim in his true crime book, The Potato Masher Murder, published last year by Kent State University Press. Please give a warm Rotary welcome to our speaker, Gary Sosniecki.
Thank you, Will, and give me just a second here to share the screen and get my PowerPoint. Okay, and hopefully you can see my PowerPoint now and my slides, and someone let me know if you can't. Well, thanks again, Will. This is my 25th program about the book in my 7th state and my 12th to a Rotary Club. So I'm a Rotarian myself. I always appreciate the opportunity to speak to my fellow Rotarians. I thank you in advance for letting me tell the story of how I uncovered the truth about my great-grandmother's horrific murder by her jealous second husband and then wrote a book about it. I'm coming to you today from Lebanon, Missouri on Interstate 44 and historic Route 66. Lebanon, with a population of about 15,000, has a balanced economy of manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism. And one of our past governors christened us the aluminum fishing boat capital of the world. So if you own a fishing or pontoon boat from G3, Lowe, Landau, or Tracker, it might have been made here in Lebanon, Missouri. Should say I also bring greetings from the Lebanon Rotary Club. We have 130 active members, a good mixture of all age groups. We resumed holding in-person meetings February 4th. We're a little bit ahead of you, but we're in a rural area. We continue to Zoom meetings for those concerned about meeting in person. Our major projects include providing a free winter coat to every school child in our county who needs one. And 3 weeks ago, we presented the last of 3 $10,000 checks to support the new Agricultural Legacy Center for youth events at the Laclede County Fairgrounds. All right, who remembers when potato mashers looked like this? Almost like the end of a baseball bat, but with a handle. Swung like a baseball bat, a potato masher could be a deadly weapon. And that was the case in my great-grandmother's murder. The murder of my great-grandmother, Cecilia, was a family secret, rarely mentioned when we got together, and only cryptically when it was. I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandfather growing up, but he never mentioned that his mother had been murdered when he was 14. Finally, in 1996, as I started researching our family tree, I got my mother to talk a little bit about the murder. She had the wrong year, the wrong location. She thought it occurred in LaPorte, Indiana, her father's hometown. But she volunteered enough information to get me started on what became a 24-year quest to learn the truth. That quest began with a letter I wrote to Fern Eddy Schultz, the state-appointed historian for LaPorte County, Indiana. Her detailed research uncovered when and where the murder occurred, September 25th, 1906 in Mishawaka, Indiana. She also located a copy of my great-grandparents' divorce decree. It's important to remember that Cecilia's first husband, my great-grandfather, he beat her, but it was the second husband who killed her. Fern also sent me my first of what would grow to dozens, perhaps hundreds of newspaper clippings about the murder. My journalism history professor was right when he taught us that newspapers are an important tool for historians, and heaven help historians if newspapers go away, heaven help all of us if newspapers cease to exist. And I speak as a former journalist when I say that. I wasn't the only family member who contacted Fern in 1996. Fern put me in touch with Paula Steiner, a distant cousin in California whom I didn't know existed. Paula shared what she knew about the tragedy and, most importantly, the only known photo of my great-grandmother, here at the left, and photos of Cecilia's parents, James and Christina Henderson. The Hendersons were Scottish immigrants who settled in Kingsbury, Indiana, just south of LaPorte in the 1880s. And that's where my research stalled until 2016, when I broke my ankle 6 months into retirement and was largely homebound for 2 months. Fortunately, during that 20-year lapse, websites like genealogybank.com, ancestry.com, and newspapers.com were introduced. So while I was laid up, I plunged back into investigating Cecilia's murder and discovered a treasure trove of material about it on the internet. By August 2016, I was recovered enough for my wife, Helen, and me, and Helen's also a journalist, for us to make our first research trip to Northern Indiana. That trip included a day reviewing microfilm of the Mishawaka and South Bend newspapers and other reference material at the Mishawaka Penn Harris Library's Heritage Center. We also visited key locations in Elkhart, South Bend, LaPorte, and Kingsbury, all related to the murder. We were disappointed to learn that the county archives in South Bend had disposed of the trial transcript years before. They only kept felony cases for 55 years. That was a huge disappointment. But then the biggest break in my research came the next month when Michael Vettman, archivist for the Indiana Archives and Records Administration, found the trial transcript in the Indiana Supreme Court files. So in January 2017, Helen and I were in Indianapolis for the first of 2 visits to review the transcript. This is when I realized I had enough material for a book. I finished the first draft of my book in February 2018. Eventually, there were 12 drafts, and until we did some cleaning up around the house during the pandemic, all the drafts were sitting in notebooks behind my desk. They're not there today. We're cleaned up. I began looking for a publisher in August 2018. I knew that the big New York publishers wouldn't be interested in a first-time author without an agent, so I targeted smaller publishers that solicit manuscripts about true crime and/or regional history. On November 10th, 2018, I sent an email of inquiry to Rotarian Will Underwood to see if the Kent State University Press was interested in my project. 3 hours later, even though it was a Saturday, even though he was out of town at a conference, Will replied with an invitation for me to submit a formal proposal. And Will, I thank you again for that. Dozens of emails followed with Will and his colleagues. Several more drafts were written, and in September 2019, I signed my contract for the Kent State University Press to publish my book. And I think the cover design by Kent State University Press is just beautiful. So let's talk a little about the murder itself. The story takes place in 3 of Indiana's northernmost counties, a region sometimes called Michiana. Cecilia's family, the Hendersons, settled in Kingsbury, which is in LaPorte County. Charlie Hornberg, her first husband, my great-grandfather, also came from LaPorte County. Her second husband's family, the Ludwigs, settled in Elkhart County. The Hendersons came from Scotland, the Ludwigs from Germany. St. Joseph County in the middle is where the murder and trial occurred. Cecilia was 15 years old and 7 months pregnant with my grandfather when she married Charlie Hornberg in 1892. Let me repeat that, 15 years old, 7 months pregnant. So I'm sure the Hendersons were not happy about that turn of events. A daughter, Lyle, was the second child, born in 1894. The Hornberg marriage broke up 7 months after Lyle's birth. Cecilia moved out of the house. In the divorce decree issued in February 1896, and this is a copy of the actual divorce decree, Cecilia charged Charlie with cruel and inhumane treatment. Cecilia gained custody of the daughter. The son, my grandfather, lived with his father, and that's the oldest photo I have of my grandfather on his own wedding day when he was 23. The divorced Cecilia met her second husband, Alban Ludwig, in February 1901 in Elkhart, where she was working as a domestic for the Reverend Townsend. Alban was the new owner of a saloon on Main Street in Elkhart, where this bank on the left here is today. That's a main intersection in downtown Elkhart. The Monument Saloon was named after a Civil War monument a few blocks away. Alban and Cecilia were married on November 1st, 1901. They were a mismatched couple from the start. Alban was 7 years older. Cecilia was at least 3 inches taller. Alban would claim later that Cecilia did not have any money or many clothes at the time of their marriage. I did not care about it, he said. I married her only for love. The newlyweds tried living with Albin's widowed mother in Elkhart, but after Cecilia was accused of striking Albin's mother, and 10 days later, her sister-in-law, the couple was booted out of the house. They lived elsewhere in Elkhart until Albin was able to sell the saloon. In 1903, they moved 11 miles west to Mishawaka for a fresh start. They bought a house in a new neighborhood at what then was the north edge of town. And you can tell on this map, there were only 5 houses on East Marion Street in that block at the time that Albin and Cecilia moved there. Albin found work as a shoemaker at the Mishawaka Woolen Manufacturing Company, a leading employer often called the Rubber Works because it made rubber shoes. I recently discovered that before the factory closed down entirely, it made Uniroyal tires. There was tension in the marriage. Albin, who was said to have a ferocious temper, had caught Cecilia with other men, including twice in their own home, once hiding in a bedroom closet with a boarder. Albin never was specific on this other than the date and that something happened, but the implication was that Cecilia and the boarder might have been in a state of undress when he found them in the closet. So besides being flirtatious and perhaps promiscuous, Cecilia had a foul mouth and a temper almost as bad as her husband's. Matters escalated the summer of 1906 when Cecilia's younger sister, Jean, her own marriage falling apart, moved into the Ludwig home with her 2 young children. On the evening of Monday, September 24th, 1906, Albin surreptitiously followed the 2 women to the 4 corners of downtown Mishawaka, and that's the 4 corners in this photo. Watching from the southeast corner, Albin saw them talk to a man named Ackerman at the opposite corner. Then he watched them walk north, the 3 of them, to a boarding house where they met another man named Fred Young, who would go back to the house with them. So at this point, you've got the 2 married women and an unmarried man, Fred Young, walking back to the house in the evening. Albin thought both men, Ackerman and Fred Young, were having affairs with Cecilia. He told a policeman who was standing at the corner, "I'm going to put a stop to that, and if anything happens, I want you to remember it." An evening of quarreling followed. Sometime between 1:30 and 2:30 the next afternoon, neighbors saw smoke coming out of the Ludwig house. Rescuers climbed through a window above the porch and discovered Albin Ludwig seemingly unconscious on the floor of their upstairs bedroom. He was bleeding from razor wounds to his throat, arms, and legs. Mishawaka firefighters extinguished the fire, which originated in the bedroom closet. The closet door was closed, and a rocking chair had been placed in front of the door. Inside the closet, they discovered the nude, charred body of Cecilia Ludwig. The fire chief later said her flesh looked just about like a real hard-baked chicken. And by the way, if I was in the right house, and I'm not 100% sure of that, I've been in that closet. The death certificate said Cecilia died from the shock of being burned. But how did that happen? We know that they argued beforehand and that a wooden potato masher was used as a weapon. But we don't know for sure who used it first, Albin or Cecilia. We also know that either kerosene or gasoline was the accelerant that caused her body to burn so severely. How did that happen? And how did fresh blood end up elsewhere in the house? As newspapers covered the tragedy graphically, explicitly, and speculatively, Albin Ludwig slowly recovered from his knife wounds under guard at South Bend's Epworth Hospital. The dramatic trial began in South Bend with jury selection on Monday, April 22nd, 1907, putting the murder back on page 1. The trial would last 5 days. Joseph Talbot, St. Joseph County's newly elected state's attorney, led the prosecution. Samuel Parker, a former state senator and one of the most respected lawyers in the region, led the defense team. Walter Funk, a lawyer in South Bend since 1886 and a circuit judge since 1900, presided over the trial. 29 witnesses testified for the state. 12 took the stand for the defense, including Albin Ludwig, who testified for hours. He claimed he acted in self-defense. The policeman who Albin had talked to the night before was called to the stand 4 times. The jury heard that Albin and Cecilia quarreled again the morning of the murder and that their marriage was breaking up, that they disagreed about the division of property, and that Cecilia was packing to leave. We know that they sat down for a noon meal of boiled meat and potatoes. There are two theories about what happened next. The prosecution theory was that Albin grabbed the potato masher, chased Cecilia up the stairs, knocked her unconscious with the potato masher, dragged her into the closet, poured gasoline or kerosene on her, then set her on fire. The prosecution believed that Albin closed the closet door, put a chair in front of it, then sliced himself up with a razor to make it look like self-defense. The defense theory was that Cecilia may have poisoned Albin's coffee at the noon meal and that he went upstairs feeling ill. Albin then remembered that he had a life insurance policy that benefited Cecilia. He was looking for the policy in Cecilia's trunk in the closet when Cecilia came upstairs wielding the potato masher. Remember, this is the defense theory. They argued vehemently about the division of property, and Cecilia swung the potato masher at her husband. Albin claimed he warded off the blow, grabbed Cecilia by the neck, and pushed her up against the closet wall where her head hit a wire hook, which created the wound that the prosecution said was caused by the potato masher. She fell to the floor unconscious, and the kerosene lantern, which also had fallen, set her on fire. At the trial, Ludwig admitted choking his wife in the closet, but he couldn't remember anything, conveniently couldn't remember anything that happened afterward. The trial testimony was riveting. The newspaper coverage was explicit, but with no witnesses to the crime other than the defendant, all the evidence was circumstantial. Partially burned potato masher, not this one. I bought this one at an antique store. But the potato masher found in the closet was introduced as Exhibit A. Ludwig had hoped for a verdict of manslaughter, which carried a sentence of 2 to 14 years. But later on the evening of the trial's fifth day, the jury returned a verdict of second-degree murder with malice, but not premeditation. There is no question in my mind that Albin Ludwig killed my great-grandmother and that a potato masher was used as a weapon. But who swung it first, Albin or Cecilia? I wonder if the verdict might have been first-degree murder or just manslaughter, if there had been fingerprint technology, if there had been blood typing, if there had been DNA testing available to determine if the bloody fingerprints around the house had belonged to Albin or to those who rescued him. I wonder whose fingerprints were on the bloody straight razor that caused Albin's wounds, Albin's or Cecilia's. A couple of my fellow Rotarians here in Lebanon who have read the book tell me they think it's Cecilia's boyfriend's, one of Cecilia's boyfriend's fingerprints on the razor, that they're the one, he's the one who attacked Albin. So I wonder if a tin can found in the closet had contained gasoline or kerosene, or if it simply smelled like smoke. There was testimony to all three smells at the trial. I wonder what the impact was of the crime scene having been accessed by neighbors and even reporters like me before the investigation was completed. I wonder why Albin's brother Gustav was allowed to sweep up debris in the closet, then testify about evidence he supposedly found there. Or did Gustav plant it there? I wonder if today's technology would show that Albin's coffee cup contained traces of poison. He thought the coffee Cecilia served him at the noon meal tasted peculiar that day, but there was no testing in those days. Albin did suffer throat injuries that day, but he also might have drank poison in a suicide attempt. I wonder if traces of blood that I wonder if there were traces of blood on the potato masher that was found in the closet. Again, there was no testing available, just speculation. And I wonder if Albin's sentence would have been harsher if Cecilia's sister Jean, who witnessed the quarreling leading up to the murder, could have been found to testify. Albin Ludwig was sentenced to life in the Indiana State Prison North in Michigan City. He served only about 16 years, a term not uncommon for Indiana life sentences that era. From my research of that decade in Indiana, if they didn't hang you, you got out after 16 years when you murdered your wife. He returned to Elkhart. He followed his parole instructions, and for many years he worked in the restaurant business, including in this building on South Main Street. Died in 1954 at age 85. He's buried in an unmarked grave in Elkhart's Rice Cemetery. No obit appeared in the Elkhart Truth newspaper, which leads me to believe that his family was just ashamed of him. One of the joys of my research was discovering several distant family members, one of them being Chuck Ellsworth, son of the 6-year-old boy at the left, whom newspapers speculated may have witnessed the murder. Chuck and I have met 3 times now, even though he lives in California, and he's attended a Rotary meeting with me. This is Chuck's father as a child on the left, and just recently, Chuck sent me the photo on the right of his grandparents, Ori and Jean Ellsworth. This is the first good photo I've seen of Cecilia's sister Jean, a major character in the book. Will, I wish we'd had this photo for the book. The Potato Masher murder tells the full story of this forgotten tragedy, of how two immigrant families were united by marriage and torn apart by domestic violence. And you can order copies from any bookseller, and preferably since you live in Kent, that you order them through Kent State University Press. And thank you in advance for reading the book and for listening to my story of how it came about. I'm going to turn off the slides here, and if the president says there's time for questions, I'll be glad to take questions.
All right, we got time for a few questions here. Anybody have a burning question? Looks like Rick Bisler.
I'm interested to know what has been the family reaction now that you've exposed all of this, since it was a big dark secret.
I think we are enough generations removed that those of us who survive are curious about what went on. I think if it had been one generation back, back when my mother was still alive, for example, and my wife and I have joked about this, my mother would have been proud that I wrote a book, but she would have been terribly embarrassed that all her neighbors would know this dark family secret. And of course, the joke is now that all of her neighbors' children have read the book, so they all know the secret.
Okay. Anybody else?
Just a quick question. Curious as to whether other Rotarians or other friends of yours have come up with other theories than you had presented in the book as to who was involved.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the boyfriend, if Cecilia indeed had one boyfriend or two boyfriends, that they speculate that the boyfriend might have been involved in some of this, at least in creating the wounds to Albin. I think it's really interesting that Albin had such a good memory, and his memory was very consistent right up to the point of the murder, and then he couldn't remember anything afterwards. And there's some speculation that Albin was faking his unconsciousness when he was rescued. So a lot of questions that have not been answered. I think I've answered a lot of questions. I found a lot of answers, but you keep thinking about more things that could be possible.
Yeah,
Right.
question. If there's time, yeah, I guess. Somewhat selfishly interested in just the publishing process. I mean, how did you? You mentioned that you expected that finding an agent would be challenging, and I guess how did you think about how to approach finding a publisher?
I had a friend. I had a journalist friend, and I worked for him for a while, and he had an agent on his book. And I thought, at my age, I just turned 70. And of course, I was a little bit younger when we started this process. I wasn't going to waste time with an agent. Maybe I was cocky. I just thought that I was smart enough to learn the process. And I'd had a few rejections and a few close calls before I contacted Will. Now Will knows that today. He wasn't the first publisher I contacted, but I thought that I could learn the process. And obviously by the time I contacted Kent State, I had learned the process to do this.
Let me add that as a former publisher, we appreciate it when prospective authors actually do their homework and find out, what does my publisher like to publish? So if it's a good fit for that publisher, you're already ahead of the game. So
I had been turned down by someone who I thought was going to publish me. I was turned down on the day that I thought I was getting a contract. So the editorial board made its final decision, and that was terribly disappointing. And actually, it was my wife who started doing more research, looking for university presses that and this was not a university press, and I'm glad I didn't go with these people now. But Helen started looking for university presses that do true crime. And she found two of them, and they both were interested, but Will responded first. And that's why I stayed at Kent State.
Pays to check your email on a Saturday.
Well, that was Will's the one who I was very impressed. The other university press didn't respond until Monday, and by then I was already. I learned that you couldn't work with 2 university presses at one time.
All right. Well, Gary, our Rotary Club has a tradition, and that is one of our member responds to our presenter. And today that's going to be Tom Hatch.
Wow, what a story, Gary. I know, I think you really lucked out when you found Will. And I know from experience, we have a Rotary book club and Will and I are both members of it. And I know Will knows a good story when he sees it. Your great grandmother, Cecilia, was really something. I'd love to have known her. And I'm wondering, when the movie rights are sold and the casting process begins, who do you think should play your great grandmother?
Oh, what a great question! And she was 30 years old when she was murdered, so it's going to have to be a young actress. So Meryl Streep doesn't qualify. I'd have to do some thinking about that.
I am just thinking Nicole Kidman. What can I say?
Well, even she's too old for the role now.
I know, but
She needs some.
But I also, when Dave Myers asked me to respond to this program, I went to my kitchen and I started looking for a potato masher. And I don't have a potato masher. I don't know.
Not one like this. Not one like this.
Not like that. But that reminds me of my mother had a sieve, and it had a mallet like that, and she used it to make jam. And so that looks more like a sieve mallet to me. I'm sure that it is also a potato masher. But
Well, I will tell you that I spoke in a library group in northeast Missouri, and a woman showed up with a potato masher and said, that's not a potato masher that you use in the program. That's a ricer and a different purpose. And I said, well, don't tell anybody because this is the one I bought. So this is what I'm using. And if I speak in person, I get to use it as a pointer up at the screen. So that's pretty cool.
That's great. Just a couple of other thoughts. One is, one of my thoughts is how important it is to save and treasure local history, sources of local history information. You couldn't have done this without the archives that somebody decided was important enough to save. And that's something that we're trying to do here in our community as well. Another thought I had was, lucky you broke your ankle that day.
Yes.
Yes. It gave you an opportunity to focus on this project. And we are delighted that you came to us today with your story. And I'm looking forward to buying a potato masher and reading your book.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Tom.
Well, thanks so much, Tom, for those words. And thank you, Gary, for bringing this very interesting story. And at this point, we're going to be officially adjourned. See you all next week.
Thank you, everyone.